Hello. So in this video, we're going to be introducing the concept of aliveness. So when we look at something in our environment, how do we know if it is alive or if it is not alive? And so we have these characteristics of life. And so one of the characteristics of life is that they have an order to them. And we're going to talk about the hierarchy of biological order, but this is a little bit different in which we're going to talk about how organisms that are alive, things that are alive, maintain a constant internal environment. So this would be the maintenance of a relatively, so we'll put relatively, and we're going to talk a lot about that this quarter, a relatively constant internal environment. So this could include temperature, for example. So we know that there are some organisms that can live in a very large range of temperature, but we, for example, require a very narrow range in our internal environment. And outside of those ranges, we could potentially die, right? And so we have to maintain that order, that relatively constant internal environment. Another characteristic of living organisms is that they have the ability to obtain nutrients and energy from their environment. So they obtain nutrients and energy from their environment. And this is really important because in order to maintain order, we have to use energy. In order to grow and to reproduce, we have to acquire those materials from our environment in order to produce new tissues, for example, and maybe even produce entire new individuals. And so when we talk about nutrients, we're talking about things like proteins or like carbohydrates or like lipids. And when we're talking about energy, we're talking about the ability to do work. So the ability to convert that chemical energy into movement, for example, or the ability to convert that chemical energy into growth. And so in order for us to obtain nutrients and energy from our environment, we also have to be able to respond to external stimuli. So we need to be able to respond to stimuli. And the stimuli, when we think about stimuli, we generally think of it from our external environment, but this could also be internally. We have to be able to respond if our blood pressure, for example, drops too low, right? But we also have to be able to respond to things like thirst by drinking water. We have to be able to see and move through our environment to obtain nutrients. And so this is another characteristic of living organisms, is that they are able to respond to stimuli. And even plants, for example, and fungi, and even there's some unicellular organisms that are able to respond to stimuli. So when we talk about organisms growing and developing, so another characteristic is that they have growth and development. We have to be able to respond to our environment, and we have to be able to obtain nutrients and energy from our environment. And then this allows us to, say, for example, go from a single cell to a multicellular adult. So we all start out, most animals, for example, start out as fertilized eggs, and those eggs undergo a type of cell division called mitosis that allows them to become a very large multicellular organism. And so we're going to be talking about that growth and development and how cells reproduce and the significance of that reproduction in this quarter as well. So then with growth and development, we can also talk about reproduction, right? And so when we talk about reproduction, we could talk about cell reproduction. And this type of cell division, you probably know, is called mitosis. And so even in my body, for example, I am constantly producing new cells, even in my adult body. So I'm producing new skin cells, I'm producing new blood cells. That is a type of reproduction. This is actually a type of reproduction that is said to be asexual because it doesn't produce another individual that is genetically different from the parent. So we can also talk about reproduction that is sexual. So we could talk about the production of offspring. Now, some organisms can reproduce asexually, but most organisms reproduce by recombining their genetic material with another individual. And so the reproduction or the production of offspring involves gametes. And these are the egg and the sperm. These come together to produce a new individual. The production of the gametes is meiosis. It's a special type of cell division that you might have heard of. And then they come together to form a fertilized egg. And then that fertilized egg is able to produce a whole new individual that is genetically different from the parents. And so this, when we have egg and sperm involved, this is what we call sexual reproduction. Okay. Now, we also know that organisms, living organisms, are related to one another through common ancestry, common descent. And so we know that we, as a living organism, we change over time. So we can say that life has, living things have unity as well as diversity. So living organisms have unity and diversity. So at one point in our time, in our Earth's history, cells spontaneously arose, and then they gave rise to other cells, and then we developed multicellular organisms. And one of the interesting things today is that life cannot spontaneously, or we don't believe that life spontaneously arises on our planet today. We believe that all of the cells that are around today have come from pre-existing cells. And that is because there's been this dramatic change in the Earth's atmosphere over time, with particularly the addition of oxygen. And so when we're talking about that we have unity, that means that we could trace our ancestry back through time, right? And so show us how we're all related. And the cool thing about that is that when we look at our genes that control, for example, our development, they can be very similar to the genes that control development in fruit flies or in a mouse or in any other organism on the planet. And so we can actually study a lot about human biology by looking at other organisms and specifically their genetics when we talk about the unity. And then we could talk about diversity. And so this is that organisms change over time, groups of organisms change over time. So this is not an individual thing. This is not me evolving during my lifetime as I become more knowledgeable, right? So it's not that, but rather it is that populations or groups of organisms change over time. And so we can talk about many different examples of this in humans as well as in other animals. And so this is a really important concept that we are going to be focusing on this quarter. So when we talk about this means that organisms can have adaptations. And these adaptations could be derived from other organisms. So we could look at the presence of hemoglobin on our blood, and we could ask, when did hemoglobin first arise in our ancestors? So all, say, for example, vertebrates have hemoglobin as their major respiratory pigment that carries oxygen. And so that would be an adaptation to transporting oxygen in our blood, is this presence of this hemoglobin that can be traced back. Now, when we look at hemoglobin, there can be variation as well. So we got it from ancestral lineage, but when we look at different populations or different species, they might have slightly different variants on those genes. So when we talk about adaptations, would be any trait that increases the probability that an organism will survive, erase that, survive and reproduce, because sometimes survival and reproduction are at odds with one another. Okay, so these could be physical traits. It could be the structure of our hemoglobin molecule. It could be the presence of our lenses in our eyes, for example. It could be the presence of digits and opposable thumb. So these could be physical. They could also be behavioral. So maybe, for example, different songbirds have different songs, different species. And then we could talk about even behavioral, like there are some traits in humans that are believed to be behavioral, like the ability to suckle when you're brand new born, right? So you have that, you have that kind of hardwired in you how to suckle and nurse and obtain nutrients. And so they could be behavioral. They could also be physiological. So we could talk about the flow of blood through our heart, right? So we could talk about that. So it could be any traits, all different types of traits. So it doesn't just have to be a structure. It could be a process, or it could be a behavior. And that trait could be observable on the outside, or it could just be simply observable on the inside. Okay. So that is that for this particular lecture, but we're going to talk more about these ideas in subsequent lectures. So stay tuned.